you have to mute.
Give it. All right, for those of you that are joining us, we'll give everyone a few minutes to get on and get everything going here. And I think we should have a good group. So we'll just give it 2 minutes and then we'll get started at about 9:03. All right. Well, welcome everyone. And Ryan, sound okay on your end too? All right, very good. All right, well, welcome everyone to our first of the two financial strategies for effective ag land leasing and management, which is our virtual landlord tenant cash rent meeting series for the winter into spring of 2026. My name is Jim Jansen. Anastasia Meyer is also joining us today. She's waving. She'll take the lead on the second portion of our presentation today. I'll take the lead on the first portion. Our contact information is provided on the slide that's on the screen in front of you. If you did not receive your packets, be aware that we will send a handout, physical handout, along with a quick evaluation of today's program and a return envelope that you can return at your convenience if you find this program to be valuable, or if you have any feedback in any kind, it would greatly appreciate any of that feedback. And if you have not received it, just know that we are doing mailings in batches. And also with the mail right now, sometimes things take a little bit longer. And I don't believe we'll be mailing any additional handouts this week. We have State FFA convention entering campus here in a few days. And staff that helps out with these things will be tied up during that period of time. So just be aware that the handouts will be coming. You might take a week or a week and a half, but just keep an eye out in your mailbox for them. And as we're going along today, you can either ask questions via the chat pane, or I believe there's a Q&A feature as well. And we'll stop periodically to address those, and we'll go ahead and get started. First thing we wanted to acknowledge today, the handouts, the mailing for the handouts, the mileage for our meetings and things of that nature were paid by the North Central Extension Risk Management Education Center grant. We've been fairly fortunate to receive these grants over the years, and we greatly appreciate their support. So we kind of have a three-part presentation today. Part one will be basically taking a look, and I'm sure many of you are very interested in what is happening with the real estate market on the current trends in land values and cash rents. Take a brief look at flex leases. Second part, Anastasia will be diving deeper into lease provisions and leases, and also some basic considerations for succession and transition. And then the newer component to our meeting series that we've added this year is the critical financial considerations, and it's financial considerations surrounding leases, surrounding farm and ranch transition, succession planning, and things of that nature. And if you do not have the slides, but you'd like a virtual copy of the slides, Ryan Evans went ahead and posted the handouts. You can click the link in your chat pane there and actually download them as well. So that's another option as well if you'd like to download them that way. But just know that they will show up in your mailbox if you provided a mailing address. So let's go ahead and get started. Just be aware that these numbers that we're going to be presenting to you are simply averages. They're averages based upon the information that was provided to us, and based on that information, we tried to draw together regional sets of information. And what we'll do today is we're going to start kind of at the state level, then we're going to step down to the region, and then eventually down to the county and farm level examples. So just stick with us, and by the end of our first part here, we'll give you a pretty good snapshot on what's happening with cash rents across Nebraska, across the counties, and some farm level examples. So the first thing to be aware that if you haven't heard of this, many of you may have, but the Nebraska Farm Real Estate Survey, Market Survey and Report, we do 2 publications each year. We do what is called the preliminary estimates. It's published in the middle of March, and the final report is published in June. The preliminary estimates has a snapshot just not on land values, but cash rental rates as well. And the final report in June has all the preliminary estimates information, a lot of historic information related to things like what was land worth in 1983, for example. You can find a lot of that stuff in the appendix of the report. 2 different ways to find that information. One, you can check out the Center for Ag Profitability website, and Ryan Evans, our media specialist, and thank him once again. He helps put all these things together for us, but he just slipped into the chat pane the actual link to our preliminary estimates publication, which is about a 4-page PDF that you can go out and download and print off at your convenience if you'd like. Another option, if you can't find it online, you can always stop by your local extension office and they can give you a hand on getting a copy printed out or maybe even mail it to you. And also, if you're following along, take note, we're on slide 6 right now. The slides are numbered, so if you get kind of lost or off par or you're watching the recording at a later time, just be aware that you can find the slides based on the numbering in the bottom right-hand corner of the slide. Okay. So how do we do our survey here? Well, what we do is we take the state of Nebraska and all 93 counties, and all 93 counties are subdivided into 8 different regions. These 8 different regions have similar production attributes, things related to rainfall, soil type, yield expectation. For example, the East District contains Lancaster County, which stretches all the way from Hamilton up to Nance, then all the way over to Washington and down to Cass County. And just be aware that these slides are available online. Ryan just posted that again in the chat. But the East District contains what is called Lancaster County, and that's where Lincoln is located, and that is part of the East District. If you're, say, from Gage County, that's the Southeast District. Today's presentation, we're going to be focusing a little bit more on some examples related to the Western Nebraska region. And say, for example, if you're in Scottsbluff, that's in the Northwest District. If you're in Valentine, that's in the North District. And if you're in McCook, for example, that's the Southwest District. So that's roughly the breakdown that we have here across the state. When we value land, there's different ways to value land. One value that we place on it is the current market value, and you'll notice on the upper top hand portion of the slide, we estimated the market value as of February 1, 2026 compared to February 1, 2025. There are different values associated with things. Say, for example, assessed value. Well, assessed value is guided by state of Nebraska law, and how assessed value works is slightly different than how we might estimate the current market value. But you can take a look across Nebraska. A few things to note: the overall state average value is down about 1%. Combined with the prior year, we're down about 3% from the high reported in 2024, which is tending to reflect some of the tighter financials that many crop operations are seeing. And you'll notice across the state, there were a few regions that actually noted a slight increase. And you might note these are some of our major grazing land regions of the state, including portions of the northern part of the Central District versus the eastern part and south, and maybe even the southwest to some extent, where you might have a higher proportion of cropland. You notice the markets, they're not very strong. They've slightly declined. So what's leading to some of these changes that we're seeing? Well, one thing that we like to take a look at is the historic value associated with what we're doing with the land. So you could look at the prices of corn, the prices of soybean, the prices of cattle, whatever you have it that's common in your area. And in this slide, we have the Nebraska all land ag land average value. And you'll see that it's peaked twice over the last 15 years or so. And then it's slightly declined over time. And I think we're following somewhat what happened about a decade ago at this point, fairly close. We noticed or excuse me, the blue line is the Nebraska all ag land value. The red line is the price of corn. And what we notice is there's kind of a similar trend where you have a sharp increase in the market value of land and then a slight decline over time. And that's what we've seen here in the last couple of years. And that's paralleling a slight revision in the price of corn. The price of corn is slightly softer or maybe not as good as what we had hoped for. So we're seeing that get played out here in on this slide. And what's the other thing that's influencing the market value, or excuse me, the market value of ground? I shouldn't say the market value of corn, but the market value of ground. Well, the other thing that's influencing it is the cost of financing. And so once again on this slide, we have the average farmland value of land in Nebraska from 1978 all the way over to 2026. That's in blue. And in the prior slide, we actually had the price of corn, and you could have used the price of soybeans or cattle. And on this slide, we have what is called the 10-year Treasury yield rate, or a T-bill, more commonly referred to. And with the T-bill, this is just simply an indication on the long-term expenses associated with financing debt. Now, I'm not suggesting we're writing interest rates at, let's say, 4% for a loan, but one thing that we are doing is this is a long-term indication. I think farmland loans are probably talking something between 6 to 7%, maybe say 6.5%, for example. But it does go to show us on this slide, there was a period of time during COVID-19 that the cost of borrowing got very, very low, and it has gradually risen over time. Some of that has had to do with combating inflation and things of that nature. But this trend, interest rates versus real asset values, anytime you have depressed cost of borrowing or depressed long-term interest rates, it typically is a positive force leading to higher farmland values. This is a slide that was put together for last year, and when the final report comes out in June, we'll have this updated again. But it is a set of factors that is asked perpetually over time. So on a scale from 1 to 5, 1 being negative, 3 being neutral, and 5 being positive, current livestock prices, 1031 exchanges, I think are still very positive forces even here in 2026. Some of the challenges we're facing and some of the things that were highlighted in the narrative write-up and some of the reasons we're seeing some of the divergences in the market value of land. It goes to current crop prices, input expenses, cost of borrowing, property ownership expenses. And I'm just going to go back to the other slide here for a second. When we talk about the market value of land, this is an all ag land value, which incorporates just not cropland, but grazing land as well. What you'll see is when we start going through the cash rents that follow a somewhat similar trend to what cropland has, cropland cash rents have declined slightly, as well as cropland land values are down somewhat. Grazing land values are up slightly, grazing land values are up slightly, and that has to do with the value of them. The cost of cattle, the price of cattle is quite high right now, and that's getting reflected into the value of what we have. Versus current crop prices, prices are arguably at least maybe not as high as what we might have hoped for. And input expenses and interest rates are also something that are making the margins very tight or fairly tight for some of these individuals. So what are some of the things that are influencing the profitability of farming or ranching besides the profits? Well, some of the things that are influencing the profitability of things is the cost of fertilizer. And this slide was put out on March 11th. And obviously many of you that are joining us on the call today are aware some of the events that are occurring overseas and the disruption that has had on availability and pricing of fertilizers. But the red line here is actually 2026. The green line is 2025. Purple is 24. And this is for the price of urea on left or anhydrous on right, which are two very common types of fertilizer. And what do you notice? Well, if you take a look at this chart, and that tattered dash line is a prior 5-year average. Take a look at this chart, prices are definitely trending higher. They're getting closer to that 5-year average, but they're definitely trending higher than they have in recent years. Some of that has to do to the disruption in trade with overseas events. Some of this might be due to possibility of pricing of things being impacted by the tariffs, things of that nature. But definitely the cost of fertilizer, which is a big component to some of the folks that have cropland, as well as some of the folks that might even fertilize, say, grazing land, for example. So that's definitely a concern to be aware of. And the interest rates. This is a chart we pulled from the Kansas City Federal Reserve Omaha branch office in early February. We have our fixed and variable interest rates, fixed on the left, variable on the right. What do we notice? Interest rates, while they have come down some, they're a little bit lower than what they've been, but especially for things, say, like a line of credit, for example, we're still trending in well into the sevens, maybe even to the eights, depending on the operation. But input expenses related to fertilizer are trending higher. Interest rates are maintaining where they're fairly close to where they've been in recent years. Chemical prices are still quite high, and chemicals can be used in the form of herbicides or pesticides for the crops. Many folks use herbicides of various kinds on rangeland or pasture for the control of noxious weeds, things like that. So that's definitely an expense that we're going to be looking at. And then the third component is seed prices. And it seems to me that many of those prices have been maintained where they've been in prior years. So we have a very tight financial outlook for many of the crop operations. On the flip side of the deal, we also have the grazing land. Now, cattle prices are quite good. The challenge we're facing, especially here in Nebraska, is it looks like things are going to be foreseeably fairly dry, and hopefully we get adequate rain here this spring. Nonetheless, we've suffered fairly severe damages in some of the major grazing land areas. I don't know what the current count is, but I believe it's over 750,000 acres have burned, or something close to that number. And we're going to have to be figuring those things out related to lease arrangements and how does that impact it. And I think that's something we can touch on a little bit here in our second half. So we have a lot of things that are occurring this year. How do we figure out where the cash rents are? So let's take a look at the numbers, and then we'll take a look at how do we calculate some of these things. So first of all, this is for the 2026 crop season. So this is for an annual cash lease rental rate. And you take a look across Nebraska, you notice that there's a slight decline across the state. Western part of the state, anywhere from 2 to 5 to 7%. Central part of the state, maybe closer to 4 to 9%. But things are off the high. We didn't see a lot of cash rents getting reported that were pushing the average higher, and that's why we're seeing a slight decline. And in addition to the average, we give an average that gives a range from what we call the low grade to the high grade. So starting with the prior slide, we had the overall average of, say, for example, $34 in the Northwest, 73 in the North, or 54 in the Southwest. In addition to that, we have an average for the low grade and average of the high grade. Average of the low grade is really the average of what we call the low third in cash rent. Average of the high grade is really what we call an average on the high third of cash rent. And then the overall average is what we consider to be the average here. What influences cash rents? Well, quality of the soil, rainfall, that's a big thing, especially when you get into the more arid areas of the state. Yield expectations, how competitive is the local area. All those things influence cash rents. And all those things influence cash rents and have a play on some of the different factors or features that are being reported. Now, let's take a look here. We have a question. I'm going to answer this quick here. All right, so the question came in, why would land values increase by 12% and 25% in last year's, but no improvement on the land? So the one thing to point out is in recent years, so let's roll the clock back down to the last 2 years, but let's go back 3 years. So it's 24, 23, 22. During those periods of time, there was a fairly rapid run up in the value, the market value of land. And I know we reported a couple regions with a very slight increase, but we've seen an increase in the market value of land during those periods of time because there was exceptional profitability related to farming and ranching. And you'll notice that some of the cash rents are down on the cropland side, but some of the land values were actually up in the Northwest and North. Keep in mind that's a weighted average that we presented to you on the third or fourth slide when we got into our presentation here. So that's taking into account just not the grazing land, but also the cropland. Okay, I'll keep moving on here. So this is an average of the dry land cropland that was reported in the 2026 season. Another source of cash rental rates comes from the USDA. The USDA has a division called NASS, or the National Agricultural Statistics Service. And with NASS's information, they do a publication here. County level cash rents are published typically in August or September, sometime around then. During the government shutdown, unfortunately, we had the numbers published, but we didn't have the maps published. So we put a little article together here that you can take a look at that. And on this website, and also in your packet of your handout, if you have the physical handout in front of you, if you mark where you're at here on slide 17 and actually flip all the way to the last pages, I think it's 28, 29, and 30, you're going to see on the next slide here, we have a breakdown of 2025 county level cash rents that were reported to the USDA that provided per acre estimates. The 2026 updates, they're conducting their survey a little bit later than what the University of Nebraska does. And their survey estimates are actually going to be reported, we're about 5 or so months out from their information being reported. Now on the USDA cash rental rate information, you're going to notice a few things that we have here. We have a breakdown by county, and you'll notice some counties do not have a number reported. So an example out here in the Sandhills, do we have a lot of dry land and cropland? Maybe not. So that's one reason we don't have any numbers reported there. And also, if they didn't have enough numbers that they could report a number with confidence, the numbers aren't reported. So the breakdown we have here on cash rent, this is by county. So let's look at the Southwest District, for example. You can gain some appreciation on how these cash rents vary. So for example, maybe Frontier and Red Willow County are closer to, and maybe even Lincoln County are closer to the upper third of cash rents. Maybe Hayes and Hitchcock are closer to the overall average. And maybe Chase and Dundee are closer to the lower third average. I say the county level cash rents are more of a cookie cutter. And the reason I say that is you can at least gain some insider appreciation on how do those cash rents vary around in some of the regions. Generally speaking, the farther east you're inside of each of the regions, you tend to get a little bit more rain, and sometimes that gets reflected in the cash rents. So we had a question come in. How does the UNL and NASS historically see correlation on the posted values? Well, one thing to keep in mind, they're different surveys. They're done at different times in the year. The USDA does theirs a little bit later. We do ours here at the University of Nebraska a little bit sooner. So depending on what's happening during the growing season, might have a little bit of impact. The USDA surveys farmers. The University of Nebraska surveys people that work in the land industry, people like bankers, land managers, appraisers, ag financial professionals, things like that. So is there a correlation? Yes. Are they perfectly correlated? No, but they tend to trend together over time fairly well in terms of do we see changes in that are positive, do they negative, so on and so forth. I have another question here. I'm going to wait a few slides and I'll address it just momentarily. Okay, let's move over to the irrigated. On the irrigated side, you'll see that the University of Nebraska reports both a gravity irrigated as well as a center pivot irrigated cash rental rates. These are for the 2026 season. So on a per acre basis, we have the cash rents here, and you'll notice on the cropland side again, things are down a little bit. We have a range anywhere from 2 all the way down to 7%. And this is different than what we've seen in prior years. Especially more than 2 years ago. We've seen cash rental rate changes that were positive to fairly steady. This year we're seeing steady to down a little bit based on the numbers that are reported. And in addition to the average, we have a range. anywhere from the low third average to the high third average. Once again, what influences cash rents? All the things we mentioned related to the quality of the soil, the configuration of the property. In the case of irrigated cropland, the quality of the water, availability of water, how steady is it? Are you in an area that's restricted for whatever reason or purpose? All those things have influences on cash rents. And yes, the farther east you get in the state, you tend to see higher cash rents because you get a little bit more consistent rainfall. That has a play into things as well. And on the center pivot irrigated cash rents, the center pivot irrigated cash rents that are reported assume that the landowner owns the entire irrigation system. This includes the pivot, the pump, and the power unit. If the tenant is providing one of those components, we might discount the cash rent to reflect the tenant's contribution as part of the lease. So let's look here at the breakdown on the low third average to the high third average and the overall average. So say, for example, let's say you're here in the Southwest District, average reported was 205 an acre. If the tenant provides the pivot or the power unit, we might discount that 205 to reflect the contribution of the tenant providing upkeep or repairs to their equipment on the property. They are paying the insurance on the improvements in the event that the tenant owns the improvements, owns the pivot, owns the power unit. We'll talk about maintenance and upkeep here in our second half, but this can give us a pretty good breakdown, and I think a lot of folks are always very interested on these cash rents. Once again, the University of Nebraska assumes that the landowner owns the entire irrigation system. Okay. Now, here in 2025, the USDA, on the numbers they reported, you'll notice they do not have a distinguish or a difference in between the gravity or flood irrigated versus center pivot. So let's just say if you're in Scottsbluff County and a third of the acres are gravity irrigated and 2/3 are center pivot, and I'm just making this up as an example. I know there's a fair amount of ditch irrigation in the county. The average reported here is going to be a weighted average. That's a reflection of that. So if a third of the acres gravity or center or gravity or ditch irrigated, that's going to get reflected into the average where the other 2/3 are center pivot. And you can get a pretty good understanding on how cash rents vary around. And once again, here in the Sand Hills, for example, there may not be as much irrigated cropland as compared to when you head south into Keith or Perkins or Lincoln County, for example. Now, the question that comes up is how much do you take off the cash rent if the tenant provides the pivot? Well, once again, let's say you're in, I forget, the Southwest District. 205 an acre was the average reported. Let's say the tenant provides the pivot, and based on some survey work we did back in 2023, you'll see in the bottom right-hand corner of the slide here, we had reported over half of the leases had a discount between $26 to $50 an acre. So for example, if you have an average cash rent of a 205 an acre getting paid, let's say you were going to discount it maybe $35 an acre because the tenant provides the pivot for whatever reason. 35 off of 205 would leave us at about 170. So the effective cash rent in my example would be, instead of being 205, we subtract off that 35 an acre to reflect for the contribution of the tenant providing the pivot. And the other common thing that we see come up is how much might we take off the cash rent if the tenant provides the power unit? Well, we have the ranges here from 0, 1 to 9, 10 to 20, and $20 plus. I would tell you based on my phone calls, I think Anastasia would say something similar. 10 to 15 an acre is a fairly common number. So in our example, we were started at 205 an acre, that we took 35 an acre off to reflect the tenant providing the pivot. If they provided the power unit, maybe we take an additional $10 off. So 205 subtracting off 35, subtract off 10, that leaves us at about $160 an acre. So that's kind of the breakdown on some of these discounts in the event the tenant provides one of these components. And we'll talk about maintenance and upkeep and responsibility associated with those improvements here in the second half of our slides today. Now let's talk a little bit on grazing land. And I have one question in the till right now that I'll get to in about 2 slides. So there's many different ways to rent grazing land. You can rent grazing land on a per acre basis that we have featured here on slide 29. We can rent on a per month, per animal unit, per cow calf pair, per day. There's many, many different ways. The two ways that the University of Nebraska reports on are per acre and per cow calf pair. And we also have a per acre rate reported, and we'll highlight that here or excuse me, we have this right here. The cow calf pair rental rate, we'll have that featured here in a few slides. The USDA has a per acre rate reported for grazing land as well. So the question that came in is, do you think the recent fires are going to have a major effect on future prices? Now, I'm assuming they're referring to future, possibly future cattle prices or future land prices, or maybe even future prices paid for cash rent. I don't know exactly what might happen. In the short term, there's definitely going to be disruptions in areas that have suffered from severe damage. People are trying to figure out, what are we going to do for the short term? Does that mean we're going to have a reduced stocking rate if we can get something to grow back? I know there's some very sensitive areas on the sandhill that I don't know what the grazing will look like versus, say, if you're in southwest Nebraska that has a different type of range environment, maybe there would be some grazing if we have adequate rain, maybe later in the summer, or maybe you're going to have to reduce the number of cow-calf pairs. Nationally, the cattle inventory is lower than it's been. We're seeing some of the lower number of cattle being offset by having higher and higher carcass weights on the livestock that are going through processing facilities and things of that nature. But without a doubt, there's definitely been some areas, especially in the greater western portion of the state, that have been impacted by these things. And I would encourage you, if you're a landowner, to work with your tenant the best you can on this to try to figure out. There's a lot of, hopefully this is a once in a lifetime kind of deal, but try to figure out, how do we work through this? Because what matters at the end of the day is we're trying to get the ground back into a condition that's suitable for future years and also keep a valuable tenant around that does a great job raising. So a lot of unknown, and just we got to hope for some really good weather this upcoming spring. So talking a little bit more here on grazing land on a per acre basis, and let me turn back on my clicker here if I can. When we talk about grazing land, this is for the traditional 5-month grazing season, and you can see that these cash rents, and compared to cropland, have trended a little bit higher, anywhere from 8%, 7%, 2%. They're up steady to a little bit higher across Nebraska. Oops, I skipped one slide. In addition to the average, we have the average of the low grade and overall average of the high grade. What influences cash rental rates in the western part of the state? Well, quality of the soil, once again. Maybe it's some ground that's too hilly to farm, but there's some pretty good soil there, so it makes really good grazing land. Availability of a good water source for livestock is just not having water there, but water that's safe for livestock to drink. How well is the property maintained? We'll talk in the second half on the responsibilities of those involved in the leases, but that can have an influence to some degree on these things. Prices of the livestock are definitely a stronger force this year than what they've been in the past, as given the price expectation on many of the livestock classes we've had. All those things can influence cash rents. The big question we have is, when we have these very high livestock prices, and I hope they're maintained through this fall if you're someone that's looking to sell cattle later this year, maybe early on in 27, how do we set up a cash release that accounts for the value of what we're doing? Well, that's some of the motivation for a flexible lease. And we'll give you a few ideas when we get moved on here and towards the end of our first hour. So this is a breakdown on a per acre basis. And the USDA, fortunately, in the greater western half of the state, there's quite a few counties that have some fairly good information available. And once again, this is for the 2025 grazing season. So just be aware that this information was published before we've seen some of these prices rise to the extent that we've seen this past winter and late fall for cattle prices. All right, so we had a question that came in. Are acre per acre rental rates for grazing land averages based only on responses that are sent up on a per acre basis, or are they backdoored through a dollar per cow calf pair basis? The survey reports on a per acre basis, and the survey has a second question for the cow calf pair basis. So those are separate calculations. Calculating grazing land cash rental rates, a little bit of an art associated with it. It's not, what is grazing land? Well, grazing land is anything in Nebraska we don't raise crops on, right? So is it some really wet ground? Is it some sandy ground? Is it hilly ground? Is it nice rangeland? Is it rough rangeland? All those things can have an influence on the cash rental rates. Um, so we have our breakdown here, and once again, hopefully in the North District, for example, you can gain some appreciation on how some of those cash rental rates vary around in the North District, anywhere from the mid-teens all the way to, something in the $40 range. I would guess Holt County might be something close to that as well. And also in the Panhandle, you see some variation around there, and as well in the Southwest District. Eastern part of Nebraska, unfortunately, we didn't have a lot of numbers reported. So if you want to see that information, you got to respond to the cash rent survey. Okay, the other average that was reported, this is for one cow, one calf for 1 month during the summer grazing season. So if you're going to be grazing for, say, 5 months, you would take the number times 5. So say, for example, if we're at $70 a pair here in the Southwest, well, 70 times 5 would be approximately $350. So you'd have to back out the math. Some people prefer, and especially if you're in an area that maybe was damaged by severe drought or fire damage, things like that, maybe we're looking at more of a daily basis at a reduced stocking rate or something like that. Well, you could always take the per acre rental rate and divide it by 30 to come up with some of those averages as well. I want to step through a few ideas here for the 26 season related to cash rents. And we have two different ideas. One, we're going to be taking a look at adjusting survey information. And then the second one, we're actually going to be taking a look at taking a crop share and making it into a cash lease. So here's our first idea. We have a county level cash rental rate looking at some of the information. Let's say it's $190 per acre. And I looked up and figured out that the average county corn yield for dryland corn in this made up example is about 145 bushel per acre. If I take $190 an acre divided by 145 bushel, that gives me the county level rent per bushel of $1.31 per bushel. If I take $1.31 per bushel, slide it to the upper right hand corner here, and let's say on the property that I'm looking at, that my farm typically yields about 130 bushel over the last 5 years or 3 years. If you take the APH yield, 130 bushel times the county rent per bushel, $1.31 per bushel, this gives us an estimate of $170.34 per acre when it comes to the cash rental rate. We take what we know on the right-hand side, what we know on the left-hand side. We know we can find the county level cash rent. We know we can find the county yields, and I'll highlight here in a slide where we can find that. And we work the two of those together. That comes up with our county rent per bushel. Slide it to the upper right-hand corner, and we apply it to what we don't know. We don't know what the farm level cash rent might be. So we work the two of those together, and this gives us an example where we can adjust the cash rent down slightly to account for the differences in the yield expectation. Now, where do I find county level county level yields? Well, the USDA has a website, and we got the link right here in our slide. I should probably underline that. But this link right here, if you go to this link, it seems to work best, at least on the machines I've been on. It would tend to work best on Firefox internet browser. I didn't have a lot of luck on Google Chrome. So if you go to this website, you're going to see in the center of this page, this blue box, kind of this blue square rectangle in the center of the screen. You know the website is working right when that little drop-down box on the right-hand edge of this image starts appearing. And it does take a little bit of time. So if you're in a rush and need this, you got to plan accordingly. Sometimes the website may not work quite right. But just be aware that here's a website link, and you can see things are delayed quite a bit. So, the 24 yields didn't show up until the middle of 25. The 2025 crop yields aren't going to show up until the middle of 2026. It's always kind of, roughly until the early summer or late spring after the harvest is when the yields start appearing. Now, if I have a crop share, and we'll touch on that here in the second half on who pays for what and how do we set up these things. But let's just say, let's introduce the topic. Let's say we're on a 50-50 crop share. Half of the crop share goes to the landlord, half goes to the tenant. And under this 50-50 crop share, half of the seed, fertilizer, and chemical expenses are being paid by both parties involved. If that's the case, half of the yield and half of the income per acre. So in this example, we're looking here at March. The landlord's getting half of the revenue, and they're also paying half of the seed, fertilizer, and chemical expenses. I used a 2025 UNL crop budget, added 20% onto those inputs, and that's how I came up with these expenses. Prices might be a little bit higher right now in March than what we might expect, but this is just an example to give us some ideas. In this example, $190.80 per acre. This is a difference between the landlord's share of the income minus their share of the expenses. What do they stand to make per acre on this crop share? Is a little less than 200 an acre. If we go over to July and November, we see that number can drop down to 147. And then what actually happened? Well, we got pretty good yields. Prices were off. Input expenses stayed steady. We ended up at 175. For those of you that are struggling on setting a cash rent for 2026, hopefully this gives you some appreciation on the level of risk or the challenges that many folks are facing. So how do we let that cash rent vary around maybe price, for example, or yield or expenses? We'll give you a few ideas here in just a few slides on setting up what we call a flexible cash lease. And for those of you that have hayland, so obviously there's a fair amount of hayland in western Nebraska. In this example, let's say our field yielded 1.5 tons per acre, and we're going to do a cash equivalent from hay share. So in this example, you could do a 1/3 share, 2/3 share in the center, or a 50-50 share on the right. In the center, we'd get 1/3 of the hay goes to the landowner. On the right, half goes to the landowner, but they also happen to pay $50 an acre, split two ways, is $25 on fertilizer or herbicide or some expense. So the difference between the landlord's share of the income minus their share of expenses is then, in effect, this is a return to the owner. If you go out there, count all the bales, the tenant says, hey, why don't I just buy out your share of the hay, give you a check for your share, cash equivalent from hayland share. We're taking a hay share and making it into a cash lease by buying out the landlord's share of the hay on the property associated with it. Okay, so what have we talked about so far today? We talked a lot about land values. We've talked a little bit about cash rents. Where do we find the numbers? When do they get published? And we also mentioned some general ideas, two very basic approaches, but hopefully it sparks the idea on trying to evaluate some of these cash rents to account for the different types of risk we're facing and things surrounding that. How do we let cash rents vary around a certain range? Well, we're going to look at some examples here. There are many, many different ways to set up cash leases, and I hope this summer to come up with some additional examples beyond the ones we're presenting today. Let's start what we know. We know what a cash lease is here on the left, and we also know what a share lease is. If you combine a share lease with a cash lease, it's what we call a flexible lease. So a flexible lease is still a form of a cash lease, but it incorporates some of the elements of risk associated with a crop share into what we call a flexible cash lease. We're going to be taking a look at three examples here, very basic examples on a percent change or net percent change. So let's say, I got to jump, okay, 2, 3, 1 second, okay. Got to jump ahead to make sure I was on par with our examples. Let's say you have two individuals that are trying to negotiate cash rent. One might be the tenant, one might be the landowner. Landowner says to the tenant, hey, I'm looking, I think I need 230 in cash rent. The land tenant says, hey, have you looked at the input prices for corn, soybeans, things like that? I think 170 an acre might make the most sense. Well, maybe both of the parties involved, maybe the tenant could say, you know what, 230 an acre might make sense if I get a really good crop yield or prices improve. Landlord might say 170 an acre might make sense if things aren't nearly as good as what we had hoped for. If we can establish a range, so for our example, we're going to go from 230, which is our ceiling, the most we're going to pay, down to 170, which is our minimum or least amount we're going to pay. 230 to 170 with an overall average 200. That gives us our breakdown on cash rent for our flexible lease arrangement. What happens with a flexible cash lease? If things are better than we expected, we pay more in cash rent. If things are not as good as what we had hoped for, we pay less in cash rent. As long as we are inside of this range from 230 down to 170. Okay, it's important to remember. Why is it 230 to 170? Because that's what we agreed to. Could it be 180 to 220? Could it be 250 down to 150? Sure. I would suggest keeping the range fairly tight, especially if this is the first year you intend to do something like this. So let's just go from 230 down to 170. So here's our breakdown. If you're trying to visualize this a little bit, our minimum cash rent, even if we set up a flexible cash lease that is based off of crop yield and the crop gets hailed out and there is no crop produced, there's a 0 bushel per acre average. The minimum we're going to pay is 170 an acre. The most we're going to pay is 230 an acre. Why? Because that's the range we agreed to. If the tenant gets hailed and out and doesn't produce anything, well, that's when crop insurance and other disaster programs might step in and help provide some financial assistance. Even if we have fairly good yields, that doesn't mean we necessarily have great revenue. In that case, we're going to top off at 230. So where we're going to start with our base cash rent at $200 an acre, and we're going to work from 170 up to 230. I'm going to give another example here with flexible cash leases. Oh, and I forgot to mention the timing. When we look at when is the flexible cash lease due, we're going to look at this in installments. We have usually a portion of the cash rent is due upfront. Why? What does the landowner have to pay? Real estate tax. Usually the second portion or the third portion, if you do it in installments, usually it's sometime typically around harvest is when you see it. Why? Because, well, that's when we know where the flexible lease ends up at. We usually don't have a flexible lease where the tenant pays all the cash rent upfront day one when the lease is signed because you have to let that cash rent vary. Maybe it might go a little higher, maybe it might go a little bit lower. There was a comment made here, and I'll just comment briefly on it. There was a comment made, we did not include real estate taxes in the example that was provided on that cash equivalent from crop share. Yes, real estate taxes are an expense associated with land ownership. Yes, there are expenses associated with the diesel and equipment costs and things of that nature on the tenant side of a crop share. Anastasia will get more into crop shares. The reason we did not include it in this example is, well, the cash equivalent from crop share example, we did not include real estate taxes because you still have to pay real estate taxes even if you have a cash lease. There's many, many different ways to get into the cash equivalent from crop shares and even some of these flexible leases. We're just trying to present basic examples that hopefully most people can catch on with. All right. So let's look at first, I got 4 examples, and I encourage you, and I know if you're trying to take notes, if you maybe don't have the slides in front of you at this time, just know that these slides will be coming to you at some point. Give us a little time with the state FFA convention on campus. But we have our rental rates. We're going to start with our base scenario on the top, what happens with the flex here in the center, and then the final thing that happens here on the bottom. So we have a cash rental rate of $200 an acre with an average farm yield of 150 bushel. The actual production, we produced actually 135 bushel per acre, and that's 15 bushel per acre lower than what we had hoped for. 15 off of 150, very simple example. This is 10% lower. We're trying to do easy math. We're going to discount the cash rent by 10%. We're going to discount the base cash rent by 10%. So 10% times 200 is $20 an acre. 200 minus 20 is 180. And 180 is lower than what we had agreed to. Do we pay it? Yes. Why? Because it's more than our minimum. Now, if we had agreed in this example to a different minimum number, that might influence the cash rent. But if we had an example where the cash rent ended up at $160 per acre, would we pay that? No, we bottom out at 170. Now, the next example that we have here, very similar to the prior example, but instead of yielding 135 bushel per acre, we actually yield 165 bushel. That's 15 bushel per acre higher than what we had hoped for. 15 plus 150 is 165. It's 10% higher than what we had hoped for. 10% of 200 is $20 per acre. So we're going to add a little bit of a premium. We're going to add a little bit more onto the cash rent because we produced more. We produced 165 instead of 150. We produced more than what we had hoped for. We're going to use that percent change, multiply that against our percent change against the base cash rent. 10% of 200 is $20 per acre. 200 plus 20 is 220. Do we pay it? Let's step back just for a second. Yes. Why do we pay it? Because it's less than 230. If we figured out a situation where the yield, the flexible yield, or the flexible cash rent based on yield, we may have a situation where we don't exceed 230 if we had, let's say, 185 bushel per acre. Why? Because we maxed the top out at $230 because that's inside the range we agreed to. Now, the final two examples, they get pretty into the weeds on this. I'm just going to briefly kind of outline what's happening here. We're setting up a flexible cash rent based on crop price. Let's say when you signed the lease, you were hoping for $4.20 a bushel. Okay. We have two different things that happen. We have the actual harvest time price, and if you're looking at prices, we typically see people look at prices over a period of time, let's say over 30 days. Every month in the month of March against every day in the month of March against every day in the month of October. Do an average and compare the two. That's roughly what the planting time harvest price average is. Looking at let's see here, the November corn and I forget, is it the November corn contract in December? It's either the November corn or December corn or vice versa with the soybeans, but they're looking at the futures times price average during two periods of time, one in February against a period in October, and comparing those two averages for the crop insurance. That's where we're looking at the expected farm price versus the actual harvest time price guarantee. We're pulling these numbers from a crop insurance example. Nonetheless, we have two examples. We have on the left, we have, it's December corn contract, November soybean. I was getting confused on that. But we have two situations here. We have the price on the left when prices go up. We have the situation on the right when prices go down. Once again, we either add a premium or we have a discount based on the cash rent to reflect the two of these. And I was a little bit, might have mixed some people up here. When we talk about revenue protection crop insurance uses price and yield. The yield is what we call the actual production history, or the APH. So in this example, we're looking at, let's say, the last 5 years. And then the planting time, or what some folks call the base price guarantee. During the month of February, each day that the futures trade is open, we're going to be looking at the December corn contract and the November soybean contract. Each day the futures price is open. You look at the closing price and come up with an average in the spring. And then once again in October, they'll look at the December corn, November soybean contract, come up with a 30-day average again then. And like comparing those two averages, that gets computed into the cash rental rates that are, excuse me, into the price guarantees and the potential disaster payments made under crop insurance policies. Not the cash rents. They aren't computed into cash rents. They are computed into the crop insurance guarantees associated with crop insurance. And then our final slide here before we get started. We had one question come in. Let's see. Let's look at this last example here just briefly, and then we'll go over one question, then Anastasia will get started. The final example here, we're doing a flexible cash lease based on crop revenue. So in this example, we're combining, okay, we expect to have our base cash rent at $200 an acre. We hope the cash yield, we hope for about 150 bushel, expected cash price of $466 a bushel, expected farm revenues is slightly under $700 an acre. So on one example here on the left, we have a situation where the yield is down, but prices are up. Right-hand side, yields are up, but prices are down. And you work through this. This just goes to show you just because you have a poor yield but better prices, you might still have better crop revenue versus on the right-hand side. Just because prices go down doesn't mean you end up with good crop revenue, even if you have an improved yield over our expectations. I'll tell you, if you are interested in some of these examples, the best thing I can tell you to do is either print out or bring these examples open on your computer at a later time and try to kind of work through them with a calculator at your leisure or an Excel spreadsheet or something and replicate. That's the only way you can really learn them well. But if we made you think a little bit differently about cash rents, that's definitely an improvement over where things have been. Cash rent, people usually think it's fixed or a steady number for the season. Well, it's influenced by a lot of risk. All right, so final question I'll ask you. How do you figure in any government payments, which may be unknown, or even if they happen, who knows what the payments might be? According to the USDA Farm Service Agency, regulations that guide the disbursement or payments of disaster payments of various kinds, the payments only go to the individual bearing production risk. In the case of a crop share, the disaster payments are split in proportion to the lease. So if you're on a 50-50 crop share, half the payment goes to the landlord. If they're on a crop share, the other half goes to the tenant, or who's also the operator in this case. Both of the individuals on a crop share are operators. This is based on federal statute and laws that guide the payments. If you're on a cash lease, all disaster payments go to the tenant because they are the individual bearing production risk. A question came in, do you already have the variable rent spreadsheet in Excel that we can share? These are simply just tables that we have here on these slides. I don't think we have anything at this time out online. There might be Kansas State or University of Minnesota Center for Farm Financial Management. I think they have a website called like fairrent.org where they do some of this flexible lease stuff. Question came in again. How can you comment on the flexible flex lease calculator spreadsheet? There was a spreadsheet created at one time for flex leases. I don't know if it's on our website anymore or not. I don't believe it's currently being supported. Okay, with that, I'm going to have Anastasia share her slides, and I'm going to.
Okay. Can you guys hear me all right? Perfect. Okay. So today I get to talk to you guys about agricultural leases, your crop share leases, how to adjust them. We're going to dive a little bit deeper into those government payments, and really how to set yourself and the other party up for success. Okay. So I'm going to move that around. So just a reminder, a crop share lease, both the landlord and the tenant share risk, they share inputs, they receive a percentage of the actual crop, and then that's what they have to market. So because that landowner has that share, they share the risk, they are an operator, they will be recognized at the operator as an operator at FSA, at crop insurance throughout the time, even if you're not sitting in the tractor. So it could be a fair way to rent, but you have to really sit down to look at what your expenses are. The land taxes, the machinery costs, the labor costs. Really sit down and look at what's all going into that land other than just, these are my expenses of seed, this is my chemical. A lot of times people forget about that machinery aspect of it. So it's a great way to rent, but you have to be willing to sit down and talk to one another and make sure that you guys are both getting what you should be out of it. And it also requires both parties to market grain. A lot of times when I talk to people who are inheriting ground, this is a thing that really scares them, that marketing the grain. It's intimidating, especially if you've never budgeted your grain income to pay for the expenses for next year or to pay for the taxes for next year. This is really intimidating as more and more people are getting removed from the farm. So be willing to help your landowner through this. If you are a landowner, be willing to ask those questions. It's a great way to share in the risk and the reward, but it does require more of a relationship because you are so involved. It's not just a simple cash rent. Here's pay this, great, have a nice day. You guys are both operators. You both need to have some input and communication. So, like I said, both parties will receive their revenue from the crop sales. You are eligible to purchase crop insurance. You don't have to, but if you do purchase crop insurance, you get to make the decision of where you want to go to, what coverage level, what type of protection that you want. And if it's triggered, you get that payment because you paid for that premium. Now, you're also eligible for that government disaster when it's paid. You have that risk, you're an operator, you're going to get that government disaster because you share that input and yield risk as well as the price. I think, flex leases are a great way to rent, but I think when they became really popular, government payments were not happening at that time. And now we are in a time that we are seeing a lot of government payments. Just to be aware that when we are getting government payments, it's likely because we are losing money. And so I've been hearing some people who just want to get into farming because of these government payments. I would urge yourself to kind of question that and put a little bit more pen to paper on penciling that out. So what's common? This is probably one of our most commonly asked questions. 40, 60, 50, 50, 1/3, 2/3, 70, 30 split. Whenever I'm referring to those, that smaller amount is going to go to the landowner. The bigger amount is going to go to a tenant. Obviously, 50-50, they get equal shares. But it really depends on where you are located. So over in the eastern Nebraska, central irrigated ground, we see a lot of 50-50s because the ground is much more productive. We can get higher yields. So therefore we see that 50-50. Now, when you go into ground that cannot yield as much, like southeast, south central, southwest, we see more 60-40s. Because the risk is increasing, so that's getting spread out. The shares are going smaller for the landowner. When we get into the panhandle, we see a lot more of the 1/3, 2/3. It kind of also follows that rainfall distribution. On the eastern half of Nebraska, we see a lot more cash rents, and on the western half, we see primarily crop shares because it is so much riskier to farm out there where they get substantial amount less of rain. But again, it comes down to where are you at? What are your neighbors doing? Right? That's something we always joke about. But what's common for your area? What are the expenses for your area? So this is an example. This is not anything that should be shared to say this is what we should do. If you look at it, I only have 17 responses when I made this formula, this graph, but this is my goal. I'm hoping that by summer I have enough surveys from crop shares that I will have enough to say on a 50-50 for this region. This is what's typically shared. These are the expenses that are typically shared. This is what a landowner typically covers. The tenant typically covers or not applicable. I got a little bit lazy here and I put app by tenant. I should have expanded that. But it's an application like that specialty application, whether it's by drones, planes, or those large chemical sprayers that most producers do not have. So when you see app by tenant or app by co-op, it's that in-season spraying. I tried to make it small to fit on the page, but I should have expanded that out, and I will when we get enough. But if you are curious or if you have a crop share and you want to contribute to this survey, this is available here. Like I said, I'm hoping that I can start soon and get these numbers figured out. And I'm hoping that I have enough that I can really break them into the smaller regional areas that I can say maybe Southeast does this while the Western part does this, so that we can really have a good idea. And that way we can help people when they have these questions. So this is my rule of thumb. Who covers what expenses? And so the landowner is going to cover all of the following expenses. They're going to pay their taxes. If they own the irrigation equipment, they're going to cover the maintenance, the large maintenance fees, any depreciation costs, insurance on it. You're also going to have your own liability insurance on it. I think everybody needs to have liability insurance no matter how they are renting. The tenant is going to cover all the labor. So they're going to be the ones planting, harvesting, all of that. They're going to cover the minor irrigation repairs and maintenance. So whether that is changing the oil, changing the nozzles, just maybe fixing a gearbox, whatever that might be, minor. I like to have a lease that it says maybe up to the first $500 or $1,000 is on the tenant. Above that, it's on the landowner if they own it. They're going to cover all field operations. And then they're also going to cover the cost of transporting that landowner share to a designated location. Typically, we say that that's a local elevator. But I know that a lot of people were hauling, specifically on the eastern half of the state, a lot of people were hauling to that new soybean crush facility. So if you're hauling a long ways, or if you want your tenant to haul a long ways, talk to them. Maybe it's something that you pay for a little bit of fuel. Maybe it's something that's just mutually agreed upon. Good relationships require that communication, and you have to be able to trust each other. So what's shared? You're not going to share crop insurance, but you can purchase your own crop insurance. Fertilizer, insecticide, fungicide, and herbicide during the growing season. If you're in an area that does a lot of no-till, that herbicide burn down application, a lot of tenants are covering that because it's in lieu of disking. But yield increasing inputs are typically shared. So that energy for irrigation, that bumps up that yield. So we're going to share that. And seed is a tricky thing. 50-50s, seed is shared. 60-40s, all over the place when I'm looking at my survey results. I don't have quantifiable data right now. This is just going off of my observations, but it's all over the place. I hear people say, well, my parents, my grandparents didn't share seed, so therefore I'm not going to. I have people that share 100% of the seed costs because they recognize that those traits add yield, and they are in a crop share. They want that added yield. They want the best seed. They're willing to share that. And I have some that get a little bit more into the weeds. And they look at the cost of what that conventional seed cost is. They look at the cost of what they are wanting to plant. And then they share on that technology trait because they recognize that insecticide, fungicide, all of those might be decreased with that extra seed cost. But again, you have to be willing to sit down and look at what your expenses are. When I look at them, I typically see that seed as something that should be shared between landowners and tenants. Then again, you're going to have to market your grain. If you are intimidated by this, and you are just absolutely not wanting to do this, there's a couple ways that you can get around this. The first one is you can ask your tenant to market your grain. They might be hesitant at first, but just say, I'm not willing or I'm not comfortable. Can you help teach me? When you sell grain, it's probably a good time for myself to sell grain. But set some limitations, right? We want to say that you can sell up to my insurance amount before harvest. That I'm okay with that. Talk to them, make sure everybody's comfortable with it, but that's okay to ask. If you don't want to do that, you can hire a farm manager to sell it, or you can go to a cash rent. But when I've done my cost breakout analysis of cash rent versus crop share typically tends to do better over the long run. And then it's going to require, yeah, I covered that already. So then let's talk about some proper lease provisions. If you are following along in the handouts, I'm going to apologize because I have changed some things up in this next section, especially the last one. So it might not follow specifically why, the reason, and yeah, I'll tell you why, but proper lease provisions. So the first thing is, I think gone are the days of handshake lease agreements. Like I said, more and more people are becoming removed from the farm. If you're in a handshake lease agreement, end that as soon as you can and get it in writing. It protects you and the other party, and it protects your heirs. So in Nebraska, verbal leases for farmland have to be terminated or changed by September 1. So you're kind of already locked in for this year. But most of the time, if you say, I want a written agreement, explain why you want it. And most of the time, they're going to say, okay, and just sign it and say, it protects us, it protects you, it protects your heirs. It's not the same for pasture. I'll cover that in a later slide. So what is the absolute bare minimum for a lease agreement? You'll hear me say time and time again, we are all about building the relationships between landowners and tenants. I think a lease with a established landlord-tenant relationship that's been farming the ground for 15 years, 5 years, a long amount of time, is going to be a lot different than if you have a brand new relationship with somebody. So the bare minimum, you have that relationship established. You want the start and end date of that lease. How long do you want it to be? When do you want it to start? When do you want it to end? I typically see that March 1 date because that's when the verbal lease starts for the state of Nebraska for cropland. And so it's just easier to remember that March 1 date. When is it going to be terminated? And how much notice is it going to be? So, whether it's a 1-year lease and it ends at the very last day, or are you going to give that 6 months notice? Are you going to give 2 months notice? I don't like a lease that just ends on that last day because I think that a tenant should know prior to the end of the year if they are going to rent out that ground because the tenant is going to be purchasing inputs. They're going to be making plans. So let them know. It should not be crop insurance sale date, and you're just now letting them know. Let them know as soon as you can. Are you somebody that does not like paperwork? A lot of times that's how these verbal leases happen. They don't like paperwork. So there's a holdover clause that you can put in your lease if this is you and say that this lease is going to renew from year to year to year. And that's legal as long as you have how termination is going to be given. If you do not have anything about termination, that piece of paper will be useless. And if it goes to a court, it's going to revert back to verbal lease law. Now, if you are in a cash rent and you have a holdover clause, make sure that you have a lease provision in there that says that you're going to adjust that rental rate from year to year. And that you can cover that in this next bullet point of when is that lease going to be negotiated. I know that I have been getting a lot of phone calls that says that my lease states that we're going to use the UNL numbers. When is that going to come out? About that mid-March time, I'm getting a lot of these phone calls. You can put that in your lease if that's how you're going to set it, but just set a deadline of when it's going to be negotiated. Life happens. It's really easy to say, I'm going to do that tomorrow, I'm going to do that next week. And then all of a sudden it's June, stuff is planted, and you still don't know how much to charge or pay for your cash rent. And then when is that payment due? Again, I think it's different if it's a long-term established relationship or if it's new. If you trust them, I think it's more than fair to say that we're going to split up that rental payment into multiple payments because that way it's not sitting on a line of credit for the entire year. If it's a new relationship or if you've been burned in the past, you can do whatever you want in a written lease agreement. You just have to have somebody else to sign it and agree to it. So, if you want to terminate a lease, when is the right time to do it? Again, you have to have it, if it's a written lease, that's going to set the precedence. It's going to dictate how you're going to terminate it. If it is a verbal lease, you have to do it prior to September 1. Now you can do it anytime before September 1. You could do it March for the following crop year. So if you terminated today, if you sent out that letter, it wouldn't be effective for this growing season. But for 2027, that would still be effective for it. If you are looking for a example termination letter, I can't give you one. But I can tell you if you Google the state to the south, they have a really good termination letter outline that you could use for yourself. Now, if you are looking to start a written lease, where to start, how to go about writing one. I think a good lease can be covered in a couple of pages. Again, the longer the relationship, the shorter your lease can be. The new beginning relationship is probably going to be a little bit longer. But this aglease101.org is a great website to go and look at leases and see, how should this be set up? What provisions might be applicable to me. I know I covered in another webinar on a Thursday CAP webinar about different lease provisions. If you want more information, you can go see one of those. But Ag Lease 101, you bring up this cash lease. I don't see, where's my clicker? I don't know if you can see my mouse or not, but it's this cash lease form. It's going to go into how to structure it. I think it's a great place to start. You can copy and paste what you want, leave out what you don't want. I used to say just print these off 10 years ago, but they've changed their leases a lot. And for example, if you just were to print this off and you thought it was the same, there's no corn stalk grazing in this lease anymore. So look at it, pull out what you want, leave out what you don't want. It's a great starting point. So for pasture and grazing land leases, they are typically rented in a verbal handshake lease for the 5 months that they are in the grass. So on the eastern part of Nebraska, that's typically May to October. As we work way west, maybe that June to November. But because it's only for that 5 months, termination is technically not needed. However, we want to be good stewards and be good business partners. You don't want to be standing at the pasture when they're trying to move cattle in, locking it, saying, you shall not pass, you cannot enter, I'm not renting it to you. Let them know as soon as you can if you're going to sell the ground, if you're going to rent it to somebody else. Again, so that they can make plans, your tenant can make plans, and that you will have good long-standing relationships with your new tenants if that's so chosen. One thing that we also think about right now is in the leases is the fertility clauses. Phosphorus, lime, big investments. If you are a cash rent, you probably don't care about this stuff because you just have a flat rate that you are getting. We need to be thoughtful of what's happening with the fertility of our soil. When the economic outlook for crop production is down, we do worry about maybe a mining of the soil where we are using up more nutrients than we are putting back in. So one way you can do this if you have a new lease is you can have a clause in there that the landowners are going to pay for a soil test. Those are the beginning amounts. And then when they are terminated, whether it is year one, year five, you can kind of gauge that. But especially if for a new relationship, we're on a 1 year, 2 year lease, have that clause in there. You can work with an agronomist to say what's an acceptable level of this, whether it's 10%, 15% range of their beginning values. It protects that mining of the soil. Phosphorus can be very expensive. If your tenant have to put on a large phosphorus load, you're probably looking at a multi-year lease. Same with lime. Lime is typically going to be a landowner expense because you cannot pick up every single piece of lime in that field and take it with you if you're terminated. But most of the time, like I said, cash rent landlords don't really care about it so much. And you need that lime built up, you need that phosphorus built up in order to get adequate yields. How do you go about that? Well, one, I would say if the tenant wants to apply it, great. Let them. Protect yourself, protect them. I say have a clause in your lease that you have a 5 year lease. Lime's typically good for 5 years. You have a clause in there that says, I still have the right to terminate you if I want, but I have to prorate you the amount of lime back. So if I am renting from you, I paid for the lime, I paid for the application, the lime itself. If you were to terminate me after year two, I've used up 2 years, I have 3 years left of the line, you're going to pay me 60% of my expenses back to me because it protects my investments as a tenant, but it also protects your soil as a landowner, and it still gives you that flexibility. We want good tenants that are going to treat our ground good and take care of it. We don't want it to be mined. Which then brings me to who fixes what? My first question is, why is it like this, right? If you are farming over terraces and this is just a gradual thing that's been getting bigger and bigger and you've just been ignoring it, it's a whole different situation than if you had a 5-inch rain that you have this huge problem out in your field. Typically, anything that requires specialty equipment is going to be a landowner's expense. So if it requires a dirt dozer service, any specialty equipment, landowner cost. Now, I know a lot of tenants have that equipment now. So it's okay to ask your tenant to do that, whether you pay them or you give them a reduced rental rate. That's up to you. And then what about pastures? Who controls cedar trees and noxious weeds? We we like to have this mentality of, we're going to maintain it at the status it was. So ideally, if you rented out this pasture in this picture and it was clean, fences were good, that is a tenant's responsibility to make sure it stays that way. Going and cutting cedar trees, stretching fences, maybe replacing a post here or there. That's on the tenant. I think that's okay to ask them to do that. If you are renting this out to someone new, I'm probably going to be asking for a reduced rental rate and a multi-year lease because this is going to be a lot of work and most landowners will not take the time to do that. So if you're a tenant and you're getting this pasture down here, multi-year lease, probably a reduced rental rate, and depending on the size of pasture, be upfront and honest that it's going to take some time. It might not be fixed in 1 year. So noxious weeds, a lot of times what I see in pasture is the landowner will pay for the chemical and the tenant will go out and spray the noxious weeds. It's a joint venture, it's a joint relationship. But remember, who gets that nice little letter from the county? It's not the tenants, it's a landowner. So this is why I see it's a partnership. And remember, yes, you can put whatever you want in that lease. If I work for Nebraska, if I only want red tractors out there, I can put that in the lease. I just have to find somebody to agree to it. So if you have tillage or no-till considerations and you want to put that in the lease, great. I do caution you with no-till to say absolutely no till in the field because sometimes it's needed. Sometimes you have to go disc up a backside of a terrace, and you don't want your tenant to feel like they can't keep the quality of your ground or maintain it because you put too many restrictions on your lease. Also, you need to make sure that they are making sense. If you have an organic clause that they it has to be certified organic, you can't have a no-till clause because those production practices don't work together. So just make sure that your leases are making sense and it's not too restrictive that you're limiting the care of your soil. Okay, now pastures. I'm going to be adding a lot to this slide right here. So first off, if there's pastures, who's taking care of the fencing? I kind of covered this a little bit. The general maintenance is going to be the tenant. The huge overhauls of it is going to be a landowner. So what happens with the big three disasters? Fire, hail, drought. Let's talk about the wildfires right now going on. Any large overhaul of fences, that's going to be a landowner expense. A lot of times I see the tenant putting in the labor for a reduced rental rate, multi-year lease, but the tenant is not the one who's providing all of the materials. The landowner is paying for that. Now, I know in the Sandhills, we're facing a lot of fire, and then that leads concern with, do you have to reseed any pastures? I think, work with each other, try and find some solutions that work for both of you. It's a hard year, I know that, and you're not alone, but try to work with each other and get your pastures back up to where they need to be. You're probably going to be having a lot reduced rental rate, stocking rates. Does that reduce the rental rate? It depends. If you have a written lease, I really like to see a lease that has a provision that if fire, hail, or drought occurs, we can adjust the rental rate, but it also needs to be signed by both parties. I want that to be written so that if one party passes away, the other party can't say, well, this isn't what this lease said. Well, then it turns into a he said, she said. And so we want those relationships. If you're making any changes to the lease, it should be in writing. Um, and then also let's go on to drought. I know, this is on a pasture slide, but if you are in Western Nebraska, there's a good chance that landowners might be getting letters about reduced water coming down the canals. And so what does that look like for your operation? Work with each other, are you going to be reducing rental rates? Are you going to be switching out some planting plans that maybe you're going to try some different crops, work with each other to find that. But talk to your local NRD, see what's going to happen. Is prevent plant an option? All different things that we need to be considering out west, especially with the canals not getting enough water, with the fires going on. A good landowner tenant relationship will work together to solve these issues. The biggest thing that we also see forgotten about and is a passion project is hunting leases. Remember, when you rent crop ground, you rent crop ground for the entire year, from March 1 to the end of February. I could log every single tree on that verbal lease, on that crop lease, because I have complete use of it. I can sublease it out. I can sublease it out to a hunting company. I can file trespassing charges on the landowner because I have complete use of that ground. So if you want to go and hunt, you have to have the lease, a written lease with a provision saying that you are keeping the rights for recreational use, for hunting, for fishing, for hiking, whatever the case might be. It's not the same for pasture. Remember, pasture is only for that 5 months. But a lot of times we say, or we hear that, pasture is not a big concern because primarily people are concerned about the hunting of deer. But if you're an archery, that overlaps with their grazing season. So be realistic. You might just want to have the lease provision that protects yourself. And also know that if you let somebody onto your ground and it is out of the goodness of your heart, you're not taking any money for it. You did not know that there were known dangers out there. So you didn't know that there's an uncovered well, or you didn't booby trap your farm or pasture for the neighbor kid who likes to drive their ATV out there. If you didn't know about a danger and you let them use it, you're not liable if they get hurt out there. Now, if you booby trap it or you accept money, you are now liable for that. So just something to be aware of. I know a lot of times hunters will do like this. Here's a Christmas card with some money. Thank you for letting me hunt. Is that setting a precedent? I don't know. I'm not a lawyer, but it potentially could be. Okay, this next question was, are there formulas for cash share for grazing? Thinking about livestock forage protection and whom it goes. So remember, livestock forage protection is going to be an insurance-based product that you are purchasing. You have to be the tenant or the person putting the cattle out there to rent it. So because you're purchasing it, it's a lot like crop insurance. That livestock or that it goes to the person who has the risk. So if you are in a cow calf lease situation, then you will be getting a share of that. Sorry, livestock forage protection is not purchased. Rainfall protection is. All the different acronyms, but the rainfall you're going to purchase, you have to have the risk involved to purchase it. Just like LFP, you have to have the risk in order to qualify for that payment. Okay. Next thing I want to talk about is corn stalks. This is a very common thing I see forgotten about in corn stalks. So let's talk about it. There's a difference whether you are grazing it or you're using it as bedding. Who gets to use it? My rule of thumb is if the tenant's cattle are going onto the stalks, let them just have those corn stalks, even if you're in a crop share, because chances are you are reducing the residue out there, you're putting fertilizer back on, you might be reducing some herbicide because there's going to be less volunteer corn out there. Let them use it. Now, if they're subleasing it out, again, what does your lease say? Can you sublease it? If they're subleasing it out, and especially if you are in a crop share arrangement, then yes, you should be getting a portion of it. Because if you're in a crop share, a portion of those stocks out there are yours. If they're cash rent and subleasing it, I think that's negotiable. You can ask, but those corn stalks out there are theirs. Now, we don't want anybody to just go and bail everything out of the field. I used to say, you want to leave 40% out there. We don't want any more than 60% of the field removed at one time. And then I was driving down the road and I saw a field that the first 60% was baled. It was completely bare. The 40% over here had all the stalks. So maybe let's add a provision that say if you're going to bale, there needs to be 40% of residue spread throughout the whole entire field, not just one area, because we don't want that soil bare and susceptible to erosion that the stalks would typically protect from. And then manure application, if you're in an area that applies a lot of manure, you might limit how much is put on. Yes, I just said phosphorus was expensive, and it is, but also you can have too much of a good thing. So maybe limit the manure to one application per year. And then the irrigation equipment, again, we are making the assumption that it is owned by the landowner. Yes, it's common for the tenant to provide some upkeep, but have that deductible written in your lease. If the tenant is purchasing the pivot, or you are asking your tenant to put a pivot on your ground, just remember that is a large, substantial piece of equipment that they are purchasing. So what do you charge? You really can't charge a dry land cash rent value because your taxes are going up. But you can't charge irrigated rental rates because you don't own the equipment for the irrigating. So that's why we have that deductions, right? That's why we're going to reduce the power unit. We have that amount. We have the actual pivot. We're going to reduce that in. If your tenant is willing to put it up, great, but make sure that's reflected. You're probably looking at a multi-year lease that they don't want to put this up and then be removing it after 1 year. And then for the tenant, what do you need to communicate? Tenants, when your landowner is calling you, answer that phone, right? Force yourself to communicate. It's not always the worst case scenario. Most landowners still have that emotional attachment to the ground. They've either been on it at one point in their life, whether they were kids or they used to farm it themselves. So there's still that strong emotional attachment to the ground and they care about it and they want to know what's going on. Even for cash leases, communication should be happening a lot more than just, hey, am I renting this? Yep. What's my payment? Okay, here's your rent check. And then later on, here's your rent check again. We want communication to happen more than that. Send pictures, invite them out to the fields, let them know what's going on. Did a hailstorm come up? Is it looking pretty good? Consider just inviting them out to ride in the combine. That relationship goes a really long way. Send them a Christmas card, but build that relationship because it really makes it easier for when you need to talk about cash rent or there's a fire going on or there's no water. It makes it easier to have those conversations. And then for the landowner, what do you need to communicate? You need to communicate the overall management of the farm. What are your visions? What are your goals? Are you somebody who you never let any weeds go around the power unit and that's what you expect, that you want very, very clean fields on the edge rows? Communicate that. Do you want those road ditches mowed? Communicate that. Do you want them to plant with the terraces, not against it? Are they going to be mowing those waterways? What does that rental rate look like compared to the crop ground rental rate? Um, have those communications with them because it lessens a chance of miscommunication. And then also, if there's a farmstead, what is the expectation with that farmstead? Do you expect them to mow, right? It's funny because those things happen, right? That they were farming around the farmstead, but one person thought that they should be mowing the ground and taking care of the weeds in the dry lot, and then the tenant thought that they shouldn't be doing that because they're not paying for that. So have those communications. Are they allowed to use the Quonset, the empty buildings, and at what price? Um, yes, okay. The question was, my cash renter has a rancher that puts his cattle on my corn ground. Is there wear and tear on my well to one water for the tank? There could be wear and tear. It's probably very minimal, right? You're probably going to be running it maybe 5 minutes a day. It might just be, keeping it running a little bit longer. It's going to be pretty minimal. I do think it's okay for you to ask that the tenant puts a fence around the well so they can't rub up against it. And that it just has a pipe going out to the tank. Okay. And be thinking about these different things when you are negotiating these cash rents. So how is that tenant helping you, right? Are they maintaining terraces and waterways? Are they going above and beyond? Are they controlling those noxious weeds? A lot of times, they might be doing more than what you think, but you have to have that communication built up. They might be fertilizing a pasture or fixing something, but you don't know what you don't know. So don't be afraid to ask those questions. And then if the tenant is helping you, whether it is taking care of the snow, if we actually get snow sometime, the rent should be adjusted in some sort of way, right? Whether that is reduced rate for cash rent, whether it's a long term, whether it just is a little bit more flexibility, whatever that case, build up that communication, build that trust, have that relationship with each other. And a lot of times you can work through a lot of these different disagreements. If there are disagreements, go to one another to talk about it. They shouldn't be hearing about it at the local coffee shop that there's these frustrations. So don't be afraid to just talk to one another head on with this. Okay, and then this is a website, this aglease101.org. You'll click on the document library up in the right-hand corner, and then on the right-hand side is all of these different lease forms, right? If I get asked for examples of leases, this is where I tell them to come. It has really good examples of crop share, pasture, farm building, machinery, livestock leases, cash rent leases. It has all of that. There are great starting points. You need to adjust them to fit your circumstances. And then on the left side, we have these lease publications. If you give me a call and you ask, hey, how much should I be renting this Quonset out for? I'm going to bring up the farm building rental rate survey. I'm going to tell you a price. It breaks it down into dirt floor, size of door, age of building, really breaks it down. But then I'm probably going to tell you to adjust this rental rate, because this was last done in 2014. I know that there's been some grants trying to redo this, to have the survey come out with more accurate numbers. It's the only set of numbers I have. It was done in 14. It costs a lot more to build stuff now. I'm going to tell you to inflate it however much you feel comfortable with it. But again, that's up for you to decide. These are all just starting points for you. Okay, I'm going to take time to answer this question here. All right, they did an agreement where the tenant did all the work to the land. We had alfalfa, wanted to grow corn. The corn. Let's see. Actually, I'm going to come back to that one. That's a longer one. All right, so this is where my slides are going to get a little bit different. So first off, just know that this is for educational purposes. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not an accountant. I'm not any of that. So this is all just for educational purposes. And we need to start thinking about succession, whether we are the farmers, whether we are the landowners. We need to recognize that 98% of family farms are owned and operated. And of that, 75% still have that attachment to the ground that they actively farmed it at one point. But 50% of operations do not have any succession plans, or they're severely out of date. They're going to transfer at some point. Do you want to have any control? The good news is, if you don't have a plan, there is one for you. It's a state's plan. But do you want to have any control of what happens? You need to actually get this started and have a succession plan. So we know that farmers don't really retire a lot. Under 20% plan on never retiring. Those tractors hopefully have auto stops because they plan on dying in the field, whether you're a farmer or a rancher. Just over 50% plan on semi-retiring, which I call this my 92-year-old grandpa, who was still writing the checks, who was still making all the decisions, but he was just transferring the labor on to other people, and then critiquing how straight I was disking growing up. And then 20% actually plan on retiring, completely transitioning it to somebody else and stepping away. But UNL followed up that survey with, why are you not retiring? And 75% of them said that they have a hard time giving up control of the ground. Modern farm equipment allows them to farm longer. They don't have a successor. They think about their own death, and that's hard to think about, and they don't know what else they would do. I wish that the Iowa survey asked how many people are now inheriting the grounds from their parents. They are just inheriting it. They are retiring from their off-farm job, and now their retirement is farming, because I think that's quite a few. But just know that a lot of times we don't think about any planning until something major in life happens and we're forced to address the matter. We're oftentimes reactive instead of proactive. We get stuck in this circle of inaction where we think that we need to have a plan. Something happened. We need to have a plan. So you go to a meeting, you go to a lawyer, you leave with a headache. So nothing happens. And then another life event occurs that you should have a plan. It's hard to break out of this, but it is doable. We don't like to plan for transition because it's complicated. We think it is. It's a lot of mental work. It's hard to think about your own death. And I think the core reason is We don't want to be the reason why our operation fails or our kids no longer get along because of what we did today. So therefore, we're not going to do anything because that's easier and you don't have to think about it. So what do we need to be doing right now for any transition plan? And then this is where the slides get severely reduced because there's a lot of different resources available at CAP. And I don't have that much time to go over everything. So we'll put a link in, but the basic for the transition planning of what you need to think about is you need to think 3 to 5 years ahead of time, right? What are your goals? Where do you want to be? Where are you now? How do you get there? It's never ending. It takes time. Hopefully, you can reevaluate this every few years, not just when the bad things happen, but when the good things happen in life too. We're going to break this down into business planning, succession planning, sunset planning, and estate planning. So, business planning is simply, is this business viable to pass on to the next generation? If so, then we move to succession planning, which is succession planning of how am I training the next generation to manage this, to take over. My sunset planning is what do I need to live when I'm stepping back from the farm? And then the estate planning is easy. You do all of this work before the attorney. You take it to an attorney. You say, these are my goals. This is my number one goal. And then I've ranked them down the list. What can we do to make as many as my goals or my number one goal happen and have everything else happen as well, right? It's going to look different from everybody. A lot of times I hear people fall into, well, I need a trust because that worked really great for my neighbors. You don't know their goals, so don't get caught into that mentality. Keep an open mind for this. And then be really thinking about, who is training that next generation of landowners? Who is training them how to calculate out cash rents? Is it there's no training and then it's just getting passed on to heirs and it's a little bit overwhelming? Are they learning how to, manage a crop share? Be willing to bring them in while you're still alive to pass on that knowledge, especially if we want our ground to continue to be owned in families for the next 50 years, for the next 100 years. We have to train them if we want them to keep the ground and to have that attachment to it. So, how do you get started? Well, one, write down what you have. What do you owe? OWE. We forget about our debts a lot in this. And then what do you own? Talk to your family individually. Then have a family come together and meet. Have everybody, have their wishes stated. There's a lot more resources. I can go into this, but we're going to put a CAP link in the resources. You come up with the plan, you take it to professional, they sign it, make sure you periodically review it. And just know that you're not alone. 54% of participants feel stress over how assets are divided. So they're afraid that they're going to have business risk or their siblings are not going to along. It's a lot. It's a lot of personal risk that you're taking on. And a lot of times we strictly think of this land that we are passing to the next generation as only as an inheritance, not that it's a business asset as well. And this is what people are stressed on. This is why nothing happens because it's that fear of what we do today might be wrong. We also hear a lot of these assumptions that my kids are going to get along great. I know that's going to continue. I know that my kids want to keep this asset in the family even when we're gone. We hear that my kids are just going to have to figure out how to divide it. I'm going to be gone. I don't care what happens to it. I have 4 kids. My assets have to be divided equally. It's the only fair way to do it. And then someday this will all be yours. Remember, these are assumptions. And so you have to have your family members actually come and say that, yes, we are committed to being a family. This is what this looks like. Just know that a lot of these are promises and sometimes they're empty promises, right? Nothing is real unless it is in writing. So if you're promising that someday this will all be yours, make sure you have the right tools in place for it. And then a lot of times we are asked about the equal versus fair discussion. Just know that, this is going to be different for every single person. A lot of times when we talk about, succession planning, transition planning, we hear we either need to be fair or we want our operation to continue. How you answer that is how you're going to think about this fair versus equal. Just know that if you divide everything equal, that strategy has the lowest succession rate to succeed into the next generation. It's probably not going to happen. That farm or ranch is probably going to have to shut down. Again, what are your goals? What are your goals for your operation? What are your goals for your family? What are your goals for your farm or ranch? Um, I get it. I'm the kid who got told to get a different job. So how I look at this picture is, if my parents split everything equally, let's say my brother was the one in purple who's farming with my parents, and he's now having to buy out the other siblings. He's not surviving into the next generations because he can't see over the fence. Now, I'm not saying myself, maybe with better hair than the blue person looking over the fence. I'm not saying I get nothing, right? Because I moved away. But there's different ways to show fairness that if he got a little bit more, he can keep that family business operation. This is a hard conversation to have. It's going to be different for every single person. So in every different operation, if you're considering this, we have different resources available. Emphasize that these are your goals. Be open to communication with everybody. But again, remember the golden rule for estate planning is not treat others how you want to be treated. The golden rule in estate planning is simply whoever owns the gold makes the rules. So it's your decision to make. And then some other financial considerations that I think we need to address too is there are lots of different ways to reduce taxes upon one's death. So again, consult your own legal tax and accounting advice. But remember, the estate tax exemptions were made permanent under the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, and it was adjusted annually for inflation. So we were really concerned at the beginning of 2026 that if you were single, it was going to revert back to the 2017 numbers. So if you passed away and if you were inheriting anything over $8 million, you were going to have that estate tax. With One Big Beautiful Bill, we kept that at the 15 million. If you're married, that number doubles. And then also we had that federal gift exemption up to $19,000 in 2025. I should really look to see what it is in 2026, but I didn't update this slide. And so you can gift anybody that amount without reporting it, without again, talk to your own tax accountant. But that is a strategy. You can start gifting things when you're still alive. And then a lot of times we hear that landowners are afraid of the stepped up in basis. They want to make sure that they can have that stepped up in basis. And what that is a tax provision that allows the value of inheritance asset to be stepped up or adjusted to the fair market value at the time of the original owner's death. And so, again, it steps it up so that their capital gains tax is less. But your tax rate is going to be dependent on a lot of different things, on whether it's a short-term ownership or long-term ownership, your income, all of that. Stepped up only matters if you're going to sell it. But it is important to start to collect data on these items. It's not just your ground, right? If you inherit ground, get that appraisal done, especially if you think you're going to sell it at any point or you might sell it. But also, how much grain do you have in the grain bin? What are your tractors worth? What are the cattle worth today? All of those things matter in your stepped up in basis. And then also, how are your asset owned? In Nebraska, it's a lot different than other states, right? Husband and wife, depending on how it's owned, really affects on how that stepped up in basis occurs. The general rule of thumb is if it's included in your state when you pass, it is included in that stepped up in basis. So how it works is if mom bought farmland in 1970 for $500 an acre, she passed away, the current value is $7,000. The heirs received that stepped up in basis when they inherited the ground. They sold the ground. her capital gains tax would be whatever that selling price is minus the $7,000 an acre. So let's say the markets declined and it wasn't a good time to sell ground from when she passed away. So if she sold ground for $6,500, they would actually have a capital gains loss on their tax accountant. So this is why it's important, right? Capital value really high right now. So if they fall down, guess what? You could have that benefit in here. How it works alternatively is if mom bought the ground in 1970, again, same price, she needed money, she was in the nursing home, she sold the ground, her capital gains tax would be, let's say that $6,500 again, minus 500. So you would have a $6,000 capital gains amount taxed on. Again, it's only important if you're going to sell the ground. And then remember, Nebraska is one of the 5 states that has an inheritance tax. It's paid to the county where the property is physically located, and then the cash is generally split if the residence is elsewhere. I think this is especially rural out in that, especially important out in that rural western Nebraska area when there's not a lot of nursing homes out there. So people move loved ones to the east, and so the cash is going to be split wherever their loved one is currently living, probably in the nursing home, and then where they resided in the past. If you're passing anything on to somebody that's under the age of 22, they do not have an inheritance tax. If you are a direct descendant of a loved one that passed away, and if you are inheriting things in Nebraska, you are exempt up to $100,000, and anything above that is at a tax rate of 1%. If you're related in some sort of way, you are exempt up to $40,000 and tax at a rate of 11%. And then if you're a friend, if you're just a friend, if you are a significant other that was not married, you are a friend, you're exempt up to $25,000 at a tax rate of 15% on anything above that. So remember, Nebraska does not recognize common law marriage. So if you're passing it on to a significant other, they are a friend in the eyes of Nebraska inheritance tax. Then also be aware of 1031 tax exchange. This is a provision that allows you to postpone paying tax on the gain. It's not deferred forever. It's just it's postponed essentially to the next one. You can't permanently postpone it. But what it is you have to sell one piece of ground, like an investment property, for another sort of investment property. You can't sell a pasture out in western Nebraska and buy a new house in Lincoln that you're going to live in. It has to be investment for investment. And that new purchased investment has to be higher value than the one before. There are some strict limitations with this. The first one is you have 45 days to identify the replacement property from when you sell yours. So you almost need to have a buyer and a seller ready to go at the same time. Then you have 180 days to finalize everything. Very strict timelines. If this is something that you're thinking about, start gauging interest of who might be ready to buy your ground when you're seeing a property that potentially you want to buy. And then Nebraska Land Link is a service where we try to match up landowners to land seekers. If you are looking for a new tenant and you want to give somebody new a chance, this is a way to go about it. If you are an operator and you are needing somebody to take over, maybe your heirs don't want to return to the farm, give us a call. We might be able to find a solution for you. And then just know that the Nebraska income tax credit for a community college, make sure that you check your tax returns or with your accountant to make sure that your ground has taken advantage of this, that you have gotten the tax credit. And then if you are renting to a new or beginning farmer, there is a state tax credit available, the Next Gen, the Beginning Farmer Tax Credit. And so what it is, it offers a tax credit to landowners who are renting to beginning farmers. It has to have a 3-year lease. You can get either 10% of cash rent or 15% of share rent. each year for 3 years. There are some exemptions. It's a lengthy process to apply because you have to have your net worth, your tenant's net worth, all of that. If it's related, it has to have some sort of succession plan in place. But how it works is, let's say I rent 100 acres from you. I pay $300 cash rent per acre. So you can get a $3,000 credit each year for 3 years for a total savings of $9,000. You can see the different scenarios with share rent or cow-calf shared rent. But the thing is, this incentive is out there so that you can maybe give that new and beginning farmer a chance. Whereas maybe with a lower rental rate, because you're going to be paying less taxes. So that's the incentive or the ideal of this program. The tenant has to be a resident of Nebraska, has to be a beginning farmer with a net worth less than 750,000, and they have to participate in some sort of financial management program, whether that's a college class or one of the classes that we offer with the Center for Ad Profitability. The owner has to have ownership, and fill out the application as well. And then we do have some upcoming webinars coming up. So the first one is our land management quarterly, where we are going to talk about the cash rental rates again. This is a 1 hour webinar over noon, and then we're going to be talking about some communication, some long-term, short-term. Potentially, I might have some share rental numbers figured out, potentially. I'm hopeful. And then again, we want to say a special thank you to today's sponsor, Farmers National Company. We have really appreciated them sponsoring us and our meetings. And this is our contact information. I will let you guys submit any questions here, and then I will start answering some that we currently have. Okay. And let's see. Yep. Okay, so the question is, we did an agreement once where the tenant did all of the work to the land. They had alfalfa, they wanted to grow corn, they got all the profit from the corn, and the only requirement we wanted was they were supposed to plant new alfalfa seed afterwards. They ended up paying someone else to plant the seed as it was a verbal agreement, but this is an agreement that others have made before. Background, they purchased the alfalfa, it was fairly old, the land was really bumpy, now it's more flat. So if the person would have planted the seed, I feel like it would have been worth it.
The big thing, anytime you have agreements where there's investments made in beyond basic things, even like planting cover crops, putting in culverts, doing dirt work, removing old improvements, like an old barn or an old house or something. It's fairly important to have it in writing. Obviously, things maybe didn't go completely as desired based on the verbal agreement. I'm not sure if we completely ascertained, but it sounds like maybe the alfalfa didn't get planted in a manner that was conducive to what you wished to have happened. Well, what did happen is that there was some additional things done to the ground. Hopefully things worked out. It doesn't sound like things weren't exactly the way you wanted, but at least some things had worked out. Anytime you do long-term improvements to a property, say you have the value of what the tenant did out there is worth 10 or 20 or $30,000. We tend to see people do those expenses not all in one shot, but maybe $5,000 a year off the cash rent for the next 4 years or 5 years or whatever amount it is, but doing it over time so you don't have just a huge amount of money outlaid simply in 1 year and you have no cash rent or whatever. But that's typically our suggestion, that if you do have improvements that are being done, make sure you have in writing what you want done and make sure it's measurable and what needs to be done. Are you going to do all the cedar trees over 80 acres over the next 3 years? Okay, we're going to do 35 acres here and then 40 acres here and then the last 5 acres, which is the worst, the last year or whatever. Well, we do it over time, so it's it's very hard to have someone do everything in 1 year and then expect not to get any cash rent. Well, I don't know. What's
Yeah.
your opinion?
My opinion, especially with alfalfa, remember that's probably some more productive ground than what a typical hay ground would. Where you're probably going to be charging, the crop cash rental rate with a multi-year lease for it.
Right.
So that's alfalfa is one of those unique differences. That it gets lumped in with hay, but it's also a crop, as in it can be very, very valuable. So just make that sure that yes, you are having that multi-year lease agreement, that it's in writing, that you have that structure set up, whether it is a shared crop or you're getting adequately paid for it. I have seen some that are, they're sharing the cost of the seed expenses. But again, most of them are shared situations. They're sharing the cost the um of the planting it and the corn situation. I know you have to plant something in there to break it up, but again, I think it probably
Yeah.
verbal lease agreements is why you need to get them in writing.
Right. Any other questions? Let's mark that one. It's a good one for you.
Okay, Anastasia, you mentioned Quonset rent. I have a 40 by 40 Quonset for rent. Do you have any suggestion for the rent price? Without actually looking at let me find. Yeah, it's going to be charged by a square footage rate. Jim says off the top of his head it's probably $1 to $1.50 a square foot. But I'm going to pull up this.
Sure, you moved the whole chat.
I don't think that shows up. Yeah. I would have to bring up the website right now. But email me and we can go over that. Yeah, I'm gonna have to bring up the survey. You're gonna have to tell me, dirt floor, size of door, all of that, how old it is, and then we'll come up with a rental rate. And then I'll tell you to adjust it. 20% maybe.
The big thing on building rental rates is it being rented as part of a parcel of land. And also we're seeing things, I was just reading an article this morning talking about the cost of building newer structures. And in this article, they're talking about having 20-foot sidewalls on the building. There's a big difference in what may have been built in the past. It's not saying it's a poor building. It's just the quality of the building is different than what it might be today. So we talk about what's called functional obsolescence. Same thing with like if you have a 5,000 bushel grain bin versus a 50,000 bushel. More often than not, larger facilities, larger storage facilities might commend a little bit more in cash rent. But we usually see people rent by the square foot. See 40 by 40, 1,600 square feet, come up with a cash rental rate. And maybe the other thing, maybe one in payment, maybe it's payment in the fall, one in the spring, or vice versa, whatever. And also make sure the tenant has liability insurance on it if the structure, something got damaged or went up in fire or whatever, things like that.
Next question is, when you publish your rental rate map, does that include the land conditioning line, phosphorus, etc.? And at what application rate? How is that controlled? Is that considered in your rate map?
I'm reading the comments. I'm sorry if I wasn't close enough to the speaker. We don't have a formal microphone set up here. So when we publish the cash rental rate map that the University of Nebraska publishes, those regions or zones or geographical districts are designated by the USDA. Those are also what you may have seen in popular press called crop reporting districts. So we didn't designate those zones. We're just using what the USDA designated. And we don't ask on the cash rental rate survey that, for the lower third or the upper third of the overall average that you have to have a certain fertility level, a certain crop yield, or certain soil type or rainfall. It's subjective on the person that's taking the survey, meaning it's in their mind, what do they consider to be better? What do they consider to be poor? What do they consider to be average? Better ground tends to have better fertility, more contiguous. You don't have a ditch or a ravine or something cutting the field up. More rich soil types in terms of fertility.
how easy it is to farm, right? Is it a small
Yeah.
30-acre patch or a quarter? Um, I
Yep.
call that the farmability of it.
That's configuration of the property. Do you have livestock in the area? There are pockets in the state where next to feedlots are very competitive compared to what other regions might be, just because feedlots are competing for the use of the ground for silage, for forages, for disposition of manure to get rid of it. Um, Various things. Yes, you can truck manure. Yes, you can truck silage, but the closer you are to the site, it tends to make more sense.
I also think it's easy when you're thinking about high, average, and low. If you think about like you can bring up a map that says county average T yields is which crop insurance uses a lot, that you can see like the different and variations of yield too. And it's over a period of time. Sometimes when we talk about, the 1 year yields, it's really hard to put a value to, last year in my area, we had amazing soybean yields. Not everybody in the state had that same scenario though. So that's kind of why I like the multi-year T yields as well.
Yeah. All right. Any other questions? Any other comments? All right. So we have somebody that sent in a message that says we have a ranch out in the Wildcat Hills area of Banner County. Do you want to bring up Banner County for the cash rents?
Yeah.
What price should I get to rent for those acres? Not sure how to make this pay for the taxes that I owe on it. Now, I don't know if Banner County in that particular area has suffered any extreme drought or fire damage from some of the things that are occurring right now. But on a per acre basis on slide, let's see, it would be like slide 30 or 31, you can, Anastasia just popped it up right there. So Banner County is in the Panhandle, if I'm not mistaken. Is that correct?
It was pasture.
Yeah, they were looking for
Okay.
pasture.
Isn't Banner?
Is Banner for the go up to the dry land and see what's on there.
Am I going wrong? Yeah,
Yeah.
Banner's right there.
Okay, so Banner County did not have an average reported on the USDA cash rent map. Well, let's look at surrounding counties. Surrounding counties are in the low to mid teens. And if you go to the University of Nebraska, if you want to scroll up a little bit. So there's two different ways based on the information that's published. We can talk about renting on a per acre basis, or we can talk about a cow-calf pair basis. If you're not very familiar with the property, if you recently inherited it or purchased it or whatever the case is, first question I'd ask the prior tenant is, for how long of a period of time have people typically put cattle out there? So can you put so many cow-calf pairs for a certain period of time? Let's say it takes 10 acres and you could put 20 cow-calf pairs out there for the summer, for example. This is a made up example here. Well, if we go to the cow-calf pair rental rates, I think you got to go to oops, you might have hit it on. Well, just be aware in your handouts, it'll be there where it's not showing up on our end at the moment. It might have gotten dropped or hidden for some reason. On the cow-calf pair rental rates, I'm going to go one more down. There we are. On the cow-calf pair rental rates, I'm sorry, we were out at work here. If we look at the Northwest District, in our example, if you could put 20 pairs on 200 acres, which might be, I don't know what the stocking rate is, but 20 pairs, let's say you're going to put them out there for 5 months, and if you got $50 a pair, well, you can start doing the math. 20 times 5 times 50, that gives you a cash rental rate. Now, if you could only put 10 pairs out there because it takes 20 acres, well, then start doing the math that way. If you have a tenant that wants to pay on a per acre basis, okay, take the number of acres times the number of dollars, and what does that amount come up to? I will remind you, out in the southern panhandle, if you're looking for information on stocking rates and some of the management questions you might have outside of cash rents, Aaron Berger is a very good resource. He's worked that area for many years. Cow-calf grazing land individual out there with the extension service. He would be another great person to visit with or talk to on some of those things. Just a reminder, if you have a survey, as we're kind of wrapping things up here, if you get a survey in the mail, if you can just slip that back in the mail, give us your thoughts either way on whatever you think today. And I'm sorry if I didn't talk loud enough or if we had a little hiccup, but we're we're both on campus today, so hopefully that helped. Last year we didn't do it together on campus, and we had some technical issues, but the internet speed and connection is very good here. All right, so we had another question here. What did I hit answer? An individual has been replacing older pivots from the late 70s to the early 80s and updating pumping, the power unit, electrical, and all that. Should I be adjusting my rent up for a few years? So, what is the return on cash rents for irrigated cropland, whether for flood irrigated or center pivot? Cash rents are just not a return on the land for that additional yield that you get off it for it being irrigated. It's also a return on the improvements. So the pivot, the power unit, the well. Now, for example, a pivot's not going to wear out in 3 years. Now, I know you can do a 179 deduction, write it all off in 1 year. But traditionally speaking, you're going to span that expense out over a period of time, 10, 20, 30 years, especially with wells when you dig that big casing in the ground and that. It's probably going to last for a generation at least, assuming it doesn't go dry. So could a cash rent command a little bit higher rate if you have improved equipment, improved assets on there? Sure, compared to an asset that was from 1975, that's a pivot that required a bunch of upkeep to keep going, a lot of maintenance. You really had to keep a close eye on it. Can you get all that returned in simply 1 or 2 or 3 years? Probably not. It's probably going to be over a period of time. So I'd probably look at it, Anastasia, what do you have to add?
Yeah, my first question is like, what are you paying right now relative to the high, average, and low? I think if your tenant is already paying the high, you probably can't go up very much. But if you're closer to that average range, you might be able to go up because their maintenance is going to go down, hopefully. The labor, repairs, all of that is going to go down as well.
Efficient.
Yep, it's going to be more efficient. So that's my first question to you is how much are you currently paying?
Average rent north. Yeah, if you're at the average rent for the North District, I'd sit down with the tenant and make sure you understand who's responsible for what, how things are going to be handled. And also in the North District, keep in mind in the North District, it's the biggest district out of all the districts. Are you on the eastern part of the North District, the western part? Just make sure you visit with your tenant. There's been a fair amount of, well, if this ground had a pivot from 1970 on it, 5 on it, it's probably been developed for a while, but there's a wide variety of land in the North District. So, all right, very good. We got that question done. I think I don't see any other questions coming in.
My advice to anybody is remember, talk things over with your tenant. It's always good to have a tenant who takes care of the ground and then potentially maybe who's going to offer top dollar, minds your soil, doesn't treat you or the ground well.
Right.
So, relationships go a really long way with renting.
All right. Okay, on our end, we have about 11:20, and I think we're supposed to get done at 11:30, so we get done a little bit sooner. That's just fine. If you'd like to visit with us today, reach out to us via email, phone over the next couple of days. I know I'm tied up with a few things this afternoon, but we will get back to you as time allows. And keep an eye on your mail. I checked in with the staff that's helping mail things out, and I think they'll be getting a big batch out at some point. It might be early on next week, but just know that they are coming. They're dealing with state FFA with all the blue coats that'll be on campus here, so got to get all those things tidied up this week for their competitions that are going to be going on with state FFA. So we're glad to see possibly future students or agribusiness professionals from across the state attending campus this week.
Okay, got a question. When UNL or USDA publishes a rate, how many farms are statistically involved? So I can say that, when we do a USDA census every 5 years, and that's, every single farm is surveyed. And then the USDA does a survey every year, and that's how we get our cash rental rates. And I can tell you just off of my thesis when I did the statistical, was it accurate? Yes, that survey compared to every single farm was an accurate statistical representation of what was going on. So how many farms? It's different for each area, but it's a statistical representation. UNL's numbers.
So the other thing to add to the USDA, there are rules in place, and I don't know exactly what they are, but it's based on the number of acres relative to the response rates and also how many acres these individuals are reporting on. And that's why some of the counties are in white if they don't get enough responses. The University of Nebraska, our survey process is a little bit different. For example, if we survey a banker that maybe, let's say, has 30 customers that are renting land, well, this individual would have knowledge on a lot of transactions in line of credit. For example, if you're a banker financing lines of credit, well, one of the things people use line of credit for is paying cash rent. So they'd have a little bit different understanding or knowledge on what the real estate market. Same way if we survey a real estate broker on land values. Well, if this person is selling land or appraisers are aware of land transactions, it's a little bit different than someone that might be renting 200 acres of land that responds to a survey, for example. So,
do they all respond? Well, we know that farmers are really good about throwing these surveys into the trash. Land bankers, managers.
we're always looking for more survey responses. Whereas I think there might have been a question. Let me grab. I don't know how many farms are contacted. There was a question that came in where we answered that. We're just getting through here.
I'll just give another little segment of my opinions too. We're getting asked a lot about these bridge payments, especially if you're in a cash rent. I personally, this is my own thoughts. I think that those payments are probably what kept cash rent pretty steady this year, what stopped it from going down. But again, that's my own opinion.
All right, so I think remember those disaster payments are there to help provide safety in the event of undesirable events, a disruption in trade that causes a depression or a lower corn, soybean prices that might be different than what we're experiencing currently. With that, I think we're going to call the time. I thank everyone for attending today. We still have a few people on here, but I think we appreciate everyone joining us today, and just keep an eye on the mail. We will definitely be getting everything sent back out to you. Just give us time. So thank you for joining us today. Take care.